The river took her horse first. Ida Hale felt the animal go beneath her, a sickening lurch, a scream from the gelding that she would hear in her nightmares for the rest of her life. And then there was nothing beneath her but the brown, churning fury of the Cimarron in full spring flood. The water was not cold. That was the terrifying thing. It was warm and violent and absolute, the color of old brass, and it pulled at her skirts with 1,000 hands, each one certain and merciless in its intention to drag her under. She did not scream. There was no one to hear her. She had been 3 weeks on the road from Wichita, Kansas, making her way southwest into the Oklahoma Territory, and the last human face she had seen was the ferryman at Caldwell who had told her, with a gap-toothed grin she had not trusted, that the Cimarron was running high but passable if she stayed east of the cottonwoods. She had believed him because she had no choice. She had a letter in her saddlebag now, being carried downstream by what remained of her saddle, that told her she had exactly 11 days left before the bank in Beaumont took the deed to her late father's land for unpaid debt. 11 days, 70 miles, and now a river that wanted to kill her. She fought. That was the only word for what Ida Hale did in the Cimarron River on the 14th of May, 1882. She fought the water with every ounce of the stubbornness that had kept her alive through 2 hard winters alone on the Kansas flats, through the cholera that had taken her mother when Ida was 12 and her father when she was 26. She fought it the way she had fought every single thing the frontier had ever thrown at her, with her jaw set and her eyes open, and her hands working against the current even when her arms were burning, and her lungs felt like they were being squeezed by a fist made of river water and despair. She was 28 years old, and she refused to die in a flood. She kicked. She clawed at the surface. She saw a cottonwood branch rush past and grabbed it with both hands, and the branch swung her sideways in the current, and suddenly she was not being carried downstream anymore but being dragged, slowly and agonizingly, toward the far bank. The wrong bank. The south bank. The bank she had not intended to reach when she had ridden into the river 3 minutes ago with her father's deed sewn into the lining of her coat and her whole future balanced on getting to the other side. She heard a shout. Through the roar of the water and the pounding of her own blood in her ears, she heard a human voice, male, deep, urgent, with something that was not quite panic but was very close to it. Then she heard hooves. The horse hit the water on her left side, and the force of its entry sent a wave across her face, and she swallowed a mouthful of the Cimarron and choked on it, and for 3 terrifying seconds she thought she was going under. Then a hand, large, rough-palmed, closing around her wrist with a grip that brooked absolutely no argument from the river or from her, hauled her upward. She came out of the water in stages. First her head, then her shoulders. Then the rest of her, draped across the neck of a bay horse that was swimming hard and steady toward the south bank, its rider leaning half out of the saddle with one enormous arm wrapped around her waist. "Hold on," he said. "Just hold on." She held on. The bank came up under them with a grinding rush of mud and gravel, and the horse heaved itself out of the water, and the man lowered Ida Hale onto solid ground with a care that seemed almost comical given the violence of everything that had just happened. She lay on her back in the mud of the south bank of the Cimarron River and looked up at a sky that was pale and enormous and entirely indifferent to whether she lived or died, and she breathed. She breathed and breathed and breathed. "You alive?" he said, dropping down beside her on one knee. She turned her head and looked at him for the first time. He was tall, she could tell even with him kneeling, with the kind of broad shoulders that come from 20 years of actual physical labor rather than any sort of vanity. His face was weathered, brown from the sun, with dark eyes that were currently running over her with an expression of such intense, focused concern that it made something in her chest do something unexpected and inconvenient. He was maybe 33, 34, with lines at the corners of his eyes and a jaw that had not seen a razor in a week. He was also soaking wet to the collar from having ridden into the Cimarron after her. "I am alive," Ida said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Thank you," He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he said, "Phineas Barlow, this is my land you're lying on." "Ida Hale," she said. "And I apologize for the mud." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite a smile but the shadow of one. "Can you stand?" She could. It took longer than she wanted it to, and she had to accept his hand, and the warmth of that hand around hers was something she noted and filed away and told herself firmly not to think about. She stood in the mud of the south bank of the Cimarron and took stock of her situation, and the situation was this. She was on the wrong side of the river. She had lost her horse and her saddlebag and her supplies and her rifle and most of her immediate dignity, and she had 11 days to travel 70 miles and reach a town that was now on the other side of a river that was actively trying to kill anyone who attempted to cross it. "The deed," she said suddenly, her hand going to her coat. She felt it through the wet wool, still there, still sewn into the lining. She closed her eyes for a moment and something in her unknodded very slightly. "What deed?" Phineas Barlow said. "Nothing," Ida said. "Everything." He studied her with those dark eyes that seemed to understand more than she was telling him, and then he said, "My ranch house is 2 miles south. You'll come and dry out and eat something and tell me what you need." It was not a question. It was not quite an order either. It was the kind of statement that a man makes when he has already decided what is going to happen and is simply informing the other party as a courtesy. Under any other circumstances, Ida Hale would have objected strenuously to being managed by a man she had known for 4 minutes. But she was wet and cold and her horse was dead somewhere downstream, and 2 miles south seemed very much like the only option available to her. "I will tell you what I need," she said, "but I decide what happens next." He looked at her. Then he said, "Fair enough," and went to collect his horse. She watched him go, that tall, wet figure moving through the river mud with a rancher's deliberate economy of motion, and she thought, hidden motive. Everyone on this frontier had one. She had learned that before she had learned almost anything else. She would be careful with Phineas Barlow. She would be careful, and she would be grateful, and she would get herself to Beaumont in 11 days, and she would not allow herself to notice the way he had said her name, Ida Hale, as if he were turning something valuable over in his hands to look at it from all sides. She would absolutely not allow herself to notice that. The ranch house was exactly 2 miles south, just as he had said, which meant the man was precise. Ida noticed this. She was a woman who had survived by paying attention to small details, and precision was either a virtue or a warning, depending on what it was applied to. The Barlow Ranch was larger than she had expected. The main house was built from rough-cut limestone, 2 stories, with a long covered porch across the front and a kitchen garden to the east side that was planted with military neatness. Beyond the house there were 2 barns, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and a network of corrals that held, by her quick count, somewhere north of 40 horses and twice as many cattle. This was not a struggling operation. This was a working ranch in its prime. "How many hands do you run?" She asked because she was cold and tired, and asking practical questions helped her think clearly. "8 regular," he said, leading his horse toward the barn. "More during roundup." He paused and looked at her over his shoulder. "My foreman's wife is in the house, Mrs. Creasy. She'll get you settled." Ida recognized this for what it was, an effort to make her feel safe, to establish that she would not be alone in the house with him, and she appreciated it more than she intended to. Mrs. Creasy turned out to be a small, round, ferocious woman of approximately 60 who took one look at Ida Hale dripping on the porch and said, "Lord in heaven, what did that river do to you?" and had her stripped of her wet things and wrapped in a wool blanket in front of the kitchen fire within 10 minutes. The efficiency was extraordinary. "Mr. Barlow pulled you out," Mrs. Creasy said, setting a pot of coffee on the iron stove. "He did," Ida said. "That man." Mrs. Creasy's voice contained a complicated mixture of exasperation and affection. "He saw you from the ridge. Been watching the river all morning because of the flood. When he saw you go in," she stopped, shook her head. "He didn't even stop to tell anyone, just rode." Something about that. the image of Phineas Barlow on a ridge, watching and then just riding without hesitation lodged itself somewhere in Ida's chest and declined to move. "He didn't know me," she said, mostly to herself. "No," Mrs. Creasy agreed, pouring coffee. "He didn't." She brought the coffee and a plate of cornbread and salt pork, and Ida ate with the desperate focus of a person who has not eaten since before dawn and has since fought a river to a draw. The food was plain and exactly what she needed, and the fire was warm, and for the first time in 3 weeks Ida Hale let herself sit still for 5 consecutive minutes without thinking about the next mile or the next day or the debt that was coiled around her father's land like a snake. She thought about Phineas Barlow riding off that ridge without stopping. Then she made herself stop thinking about that and started thinking about her situation instead, which was her father's land, 40 acres of decent grassland outside of Beaumont that her father had borrowed $200 against from the First Bank of Beaumont to put in a well, and then gotten himself trampled by a spooked bull before he could make the first repayment. Ida had found out about the debt 6 months after his death, when the bank's letter finally caught up with her in Wichita, where she'd been working as a seamstress. The letter had given her 90 days. She'd spent 60 of those days in Wichita earning every cent she could manage, and now she had 30 more. But 20 of those 30 had been eaten up by the road, and she had 11 left, and they were all that stood between her and losing the last thing her father had left her. $200. She had 112, every dollar of which had been earned by her own hands. She needed 88 more, and she needed to be in Beaumont in 11 days, and she was on the wrong side of a flooded river without a horse. This was the situation. She was still working through it when the kitchen door opened and Phineas Barlow came in, changed out of his wet clothes and into clean ones, his dark hair still damp at the temples. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove and sat down across the table from her with the ease of a man in his own home, and Ida met his eyes steadily and waited. "Tell me about the deed," he said. She told him. Not everything, not the particular shape of the fear that lived in her chest when she thought about losing that land, not the way her father's voice had sounded when he talked about those 40 acres like they were holy ground, but the facts. The debt, the deadline, the distance. The river. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table for a moment, and then he said, "The river won't drop for at least 4 days. Maybe 5 if it keeps raining north of here. 4 days. That left her 7. 70 miles in 7 days on horseback was possible, barely. "I'll lend you a horse," he said. "Good one, the kind that can do the miles." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you need one." "That's not an answer," Ida said. "That's a reason. I asked why." He looked up at her then, and the expression on his face was complicated in a way she had not expected. Not irritated, not calculating. Unsettled almost, as if she had asked a question he had been asking himself. "Because it's the right thing," he said finally. "And because I watched you fight that river for 3 minutes before I got to you, and anyone who fights like that deserves to make it to where they're going." Ida held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she said, "I'll pay you back, every cent the horse is worth." "I know you will," he said, without any doubt in his voice whatsoever, and something about that simple certainty was very nearly her undoing. She spent the first 2 days waiting for the river to drop, and they were not the days she had anticipated. She had expected to be housed somewhere out of the way, and largely ignored a temporary inconvenience to be managed until the flood receded. Instead, she found herself folded into the rhythm of the Barlow ranch with a naturalness that was almost suspicious. Mrs. Creasy put her to work because Mrs. Creasy put everyone to work, and Ida found herself helping with the kitchen garden in the morning and the mending in the afternoon, and it was work she knew, and it kept her hands busy, which was what she needed. Phineas was busy from before dawn until after dark, as any working rancher in May had to be. She saw him at meals and occasionally in passing a word about the weather, a question about the river, Once a discussion of the property line dispute he was engaged in with his eastern neighbor that told her more about his character in 10 minutes than most men revealed in 10 years. He was fair-minded. He was precise. He did not exaggerate or dissemble. He had a quality of fundamental honesty that the frontier tended to beat out of people, and the fact that it had not been beaten out of him yet made her deeply and uncomfortably curious about why. She learned pieces of him the way you learn a landscape, not all at once but gradually, as you move through it. He had built this ranch from nothing, starting at 22 with $100 and a small herd, and a stubbornness that matched the land he was working. He had no family left, a mother who had died when he was 15, a father he did not speak of without a careful blankness coming over his face that told her the story was dark and complicated. He had a foreman named George Creasy, who was Mrs. Creasy's husband and who had been with him for 8 years, and clearly loved him with the gruff loyalty of a man who has watched another man build something worth believing in. He had never married. She found this out not from him but from Mrs. Creasy, who offered the information with the deliberate casualness of someone who is absolutely not trying to be obvious about something. He had an understanding with a woman in Dodge City once, Mrs. Creasy said, not looking up from her butter churn. About 5 years back, it didn't come to anything. I didn't ask, Ida said. No, Mrs. Creasy agreed pleasantly. You didn't. On the evening of the second day, Ida was sitting on the porch in the late golden light, mending one of her own skirts that had been torn by the river, when Phineas came and sat in the other chair without asking if he might. She did not point out that he had not asked because it was his porch. They sat in silence for a while, which was a comfortable silence rather than an awkward one, and this itself was notable. You're from Kansas originally, he said. Born in Missouri, Ida said, not looking up from her needle. Father moved us to Kansas when I was 10. He believed in the land, believed in it the way some men believe in Scripture. That a good quality or a dangerous one, she thought about it. Both, she said, usually at the same time. He was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, what was he like? No one had asked her that. In the 6 months since her father's death, the people who had inquired about him had inquired about the land or the debt or the logistics of the funeral, and not a single person had asked what the man himself had been like. She set down her mending. Stubborn, she said. Funny when he let himself be. He could name every plant on the prairie, the scientific names, the common names, the ones the Osage called them. He carried a battered copy of Darwin everywhere he went and argued with it in the margins. She paused. He believed that people were essentially good, and that the land was essentially fair, and that hard work would always be enough. None of those things turned out to be true, but he never stopped believing them. The silence after that was warm and full of something she did not try to name. I think that's a fine way to live, Phineas said quietly. She looked at him. The evening light was doing something unreasonable to his face, softening the weathered lines of it, and she was aware, in a way she had been successfully avoiding for 2 days, that this man was very quietly and entirely without any apparent agenda making her feel safe. Which was the most dangerous thing he could possibly do. You don't know me, she said. You shouldn't trust me so easily. He turned his head and looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. I know what I've seen. You've seen 2 days. I saw 3 minutes in a river first, he said. That was enough. She picked up her mending and looked at it without seeing it and told herself with great firmness that she was not going to make anything complicated about a practical situation. She was going to wait for the river to drop, take his horse, get to Beaumont, save her father's land, and go home. She was going to do all of this with efficiency and gratitude, and without allowing herself to feel one single thing that did not serve those goals. She was going to do that. She did not entirely do that. On the 3rd day the rain returned, which meant the river was not dropping, and Mrs. Creasy announced that she had a list of things she needed from the storage barn, and would Ida mind helping her locate them. The storage barn was large and somewhat disorganized, and the search for several bolts of cloth and 2 specific cans of lamp oil kept them occupied for the better part of an hour. It was during this search that Ida found the letters. They were in an old trunk in the corner of the barn, half buried under a canvas tarpaulin, and she would not have noticed them at all except that the lid of the trunk was not quite closed, and when she moved the tarpaulin to look behind it, the lid swung open and she saw them. A stack of letters, tied with a piece of string, the topmost one addressed in a handwriting she recognized because it was the same looping, careful script as the letter she carried sewn into her coat. The bank. The First Bank of Beaumont. She did not read them. She closed the trunk and moved the tarpaulin back and said nothing to Mrs. Creasy and spent the rest of the day turning what she had seen over in her mind like a stone in a stream, looking at all its sides. At supper she said, "Do you have business in Beaumont?" Phineas looked up from his plate. Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt exactly, but a cautiousness she had not seen from him before. "I've had some correspondence with a bank there," he said. "The First Bank of Beaumont." The pause was very slight, but she was very good at reading slight pauses. "Yes," he said. "Regarding land." He set down his fork. He looked at her across the table with an expression that was difficult to interpret and said, "I bought a note from them about 6 months ago. A debt note on some land north of town." The kitchen was very quiet. Even Mrs. Creasy at the stove had gone entirely still. 40 acres, Ida said, with a new well. The expression on his face told her she was right before he said a word. She stood up from the table. Her hands were steady, which she was proud of. "You own my father's debt," she said. "Ida, you own the note that will take his land in 11 days if I cannot pay it." Her voice was level. She was working very hard to keep it level. "And you pulled me out of that river and brought me to your house and offered to lend me a horse to get to Beaumont, and you never mentioned it. Not once." He had risen from his chair as well. "I didn't know whose land it was. I bought the note as an investment. The bank wanted cash for it, and I had cash, and the land is good land. I didn't know anything about your father. I didn't know anything about you." "But you know now," she said. "You've known for at least 2 days." He was silent. That silence was its own answer. "How long?" she said. "When did you work it out?" "The first night," he said quietly. "When you told me about the debt and the deadline. I went through my papers and found it." 3 days. He had known for 3 days and said nothing, and she had been sitting at his table and sleeping under his roof and mending her skirts on his porch while he knew that he was the man who stood between her and the thing she was crossing a flooded territory to save. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Because I was trying to figure out how to tell you that I intend to forgive the note." The words landed in the silence like stones in still water, and the ripples spread, and Ida stared at him. "Forgive it," she repeated. "I never meant to take the land," he said. "I was looking for a sound investment, not someone's." He stopped. He seemed to be choosing his words with great care. "I have enough. I don't need 40 acres of someone's grief." She thought about what it would mean to simply accept this. To let this man, this stranger who had pulled her from a river and fed her, and offered her a horse and now stood before her in his own kitchen telling her he intended to erase a debt that had cost her 60 days in a Wichita seamstress shop and 3 weeks on the road and 1 horse in a flood to let him simply fix her problem. She thought about what it would cost her to accept that. "I can't accept a gift like that," she said. "I don't know you well enough." "Then you can pay me back," he said, "any amount you have. On whatever timeline you can manage. The land is yours. It was your father's and it should be yours." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because it's the right thing," he said again. She had the sudden, disorienting sense that she was not in a simple, practical situation at all. She was in something much more complicated than that, and it had started the moment a hand had closed around her wrist in the Cimarron River and pulled her toward air. "I'll pay you every cent," she said. "I have $112 and I'll send you the rest." "Ida," his voice was very quiet, "just let me help you." "I don't need saving," she said. "I already saved myself." "You just helped with the last part." And then something entirely unexpected happened, which was that Phineas Barlow smiled. Not the shadow of a smile she had seen before, but an actual, full, proper smile that transformed his weathered face into something she was not at all prepared for, and he said, I think that might be the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me." The tension in the room did not entirely dissolve, but it changed. It became something warmer. She sat back down. After a moment, so did he. Mrs. Creasy, with great tact, found it necessary to check on something in the pantry. "You need to tell me everything," Ida said. "No more hidden information. No more deciding what I need to know." "Agreed," he said immediately. "The note, what are the terms?" he told her. $200 at 6% interest, now 18 months old. She owed $221.40, rounded up from the bank's calculation. She put her $112 on the table between them. "That's what I have right now," she said. "I'll earn the rest. I'm a skilled seamstress and I sew leather goods as well, harness repair, saddle work. I can earn $100 in 6 months if there's any kind of market." He looked at the money on the table and then he looked at her and said, "There's a market. There are 8 men on this ranch who all need saddle work done, and the nearest saddler is 40 miles away." She understood what he was offering. She understood it very clearly. "You're saying I could work off the debt here?" "If you wanted to," he said carefully. "There's room in the house. You'd have your own space. Mrs. Creasy would be here. It would be entirely proper." He paused. "It's only an option, not a suggestion about anything other than the practical matter of the debt." It was a ridiculous amount of care he was taking about the propriety of it. She noticed this. She found it, unexpectedly, rather wonderful. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it all night, lying awake in the guest room with the sound of the rain on the limestone roof and the distant voice of the flooded Cimarron carrying through the darkness. She thought about 40 acres of Kansas grassland and her father's voice, and a letter sewn into the lining of her coat, and the particular way the prairie looked in the morning when the light came across it low and golden and made you understand, even if you did not believe in such things, why some people did believe in them. She thought about Phineas Barlow's face when he smiled. She thought, "I have been alone for a very long time. I have been alone and capable and sufficient, and I have built a life out of those qualities, and they are good qualities, and I am proud of them. And I am also very tired." She thought, being careful with him is the right instinct, but being closed is a different thing from being careful. In the morning the rain had stopped, and the sky was washed clean and enormous, and the river was still running high, but she could see, or she told herself she could see, the beginning of a drop in its level. She found Phineas in the yard before the hands were up, feeding the horses. She stood at the corral fence and said, "I'll stay and work off the rest of the debt, if the offer still stands." He looked at her over the back of a roan mare. "It still stands. 6 months," she said. "I'll sew and mend and do harness work, and at the end of 6 months I'll pay you whatever remains and we'll settle the note." "That's agreeable," he said, "and I have one condition." He waited. "I want it in writing," she said. "Terms agreed and signed, proper and legal. I'm not going to be in any man's debt on a handshake alone. No offense intended." "None taken," he said. "I'll have George Creasy witness it. He can notarize. He used to be a justice of the peace in Missouri." She had not known that about George Creasy. She added it to her knowledge of the landscape of this place. "All right," she said. "Then we have an arrangement." He nodded. He looked at her across the corral fence in the early morning light, and there was something in his expression that was very careful and very certain at the same time, as if he knew something she had not yet worked out. "Ida," he said, "Mr. Barlow, you can call me Phineas. We have a business arrangement," she said. "I'll call you Mr. Barlow until the debt is settled." The shadow of the smile again. "Fair enough," he said. "Miss Hale." And that was the beginning of it. The first month was all business, and she was grateful for that. It gave her structure, and structure was how Ida Hale made sense of things that were otherwise too large to look at directly. Mrs. Creasy set her up in the front room of the house with a proper work table and good light, and the saddle work came in exactly as Phineas had said it would: harnesses that needed mending, leather straps that needed replacing, a pair of good saddles that needed full reconditioning. The hands treated her with a respectful wariness that was perfectly appropriate, and gradually, over the first 2 weeks, gave way to a more relaxed familiarity as they figured out that she was competent and direct, and not easily rattled. George Creasy in particular seemed to decide she was acceptable. He was a large, quiet man with a gray beard and very sharp gray eyes, and he had a habit of appearing in doorways when conversations were happening that she found either comforting or unsettling depending on the conversation. Phineas was professional, courteous, consistently, carefully, maddeningly professional. He consulted her about the work, paid her on time against the debt ledger, asked her opinion about things when it was relevant. The kitchen garden, a piece of equipment, once an argument about the best way to treat a horse with a stone bruise, and otherwise left her entirely alone. It should have been exactly what she wanted. It was exactly what she wanted. She was aware that she was also counting the days between the moments when she wasn't alone with him. He rode out one morning in the third week and came back with a leatherworking kit that was better than the one she had and set it on her work table without comment. She looked at it and then looked at him. "It's a tool for the work," he said. "Consider it an advance on the supplies." "I didn't ask for an advance." "I know," he said, "but the kit you have won't handle the heavier harness work, and the Milford order needs to be done by the 15th. She looked at the kit. It was a very good kit, the kind of quality that spoke to someone who had paid close attention to what would actually be useful, rather than simply buying the most expensive option. She thought about him going into town and selecting it, thinking about what she needed. "Thank you," she said, with more warmth than she had intended. He nodded and left, and she sat with the new kit on her work table and thought about secrets and dark pasts and hidden motives, because she was a woman who had learned to be suspicious of kindness, and she still did not entirely understand why Phineas Barlow was kind in the way that he was. Not performatively, not with any visible expectation of return. Just quietly and practically and consistently, the way you water a garden, not because you expect immediate results but because that's simply what you do if you want anything to grow. She wrote a letter to Beaumont. She wanted to be sure the land situation was formally recorded and that no one else had a claim on the debt now that Phineas held the note. The reply came back 3 weeks later and confirmed everything he had told her, which she had already believed but wanted to verify. She was thorough by nature. The reply also mentioned, incidentally, that the original loan officer at the First Bank of Beaumont, a man named Aldrich Wells, who had written the original note with terms that were, in the letter's carefully neutral language, not entirely standard, had been dismissed from his position following an investigation into his lending practices. She sat with this information for a full day before she mentioned it to Phineas. "I heard something like that," he said, when she brought it up at supper. Wells had a habit of writing notes on good land with terms designed to make default likely. He'd collect the notes at a discount and then wait for the land. "So my father." "Your father was likely targeted," Phineas said, quietly and directly. $200 on 40 acres of grassland with a well is not a standard investment for a bank. It's too small to be worth the paperwork unless the lender expects to collect the land instead of the money. She had known this, in the way you know things you don't want to examine directly. Hearing it said plainly by someone else was different. The anger that moved through her was clean and cold and had nowhere to go. "He believed in people," she said. "I know," Phineas said. "That's not a failure. That's a cruelty done to him by someone who should have known better." She looked at her hands on the table. The anger settled into something more permanent and more quiet. "Is Wells still in Beaumont?" "He left the territory," Phineas said. "I don't know where." She nodded. She let it go because there was nothing to be done with it, and letting things go when there was nothing to be done was another thing the frontier had taught her. You didn't carry the weight of everything you couldn't fix. You'd never carry anything else. "Thank you for telling me the whole of it," she said. "I told you I would," he said. "No more hidden information." She looked at him. "You found out about Wells, and that's part of why you were willing to forgive the note." It was not a question, but he answered it anyway. "Yes," he said. "I don't want land that was taken dishonestly, even indirectly." She thought about what it meant to be the kind of man who worried about how land was taken. She had known men who didn't think about that at all, who thought the frontier was simply a place where you grabbed what you could, and the only question was whether you were fast enough. Those men were everywhere, and many of them had prospered, and she had never liked any of them. She said, Phineas. It slipped out the first time she had used his given name. He looked up with an expression that was very still and very attentive. I think you're a good man, she said. I wanted to say that plainly, since I was also plain earlier about the other things. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I think you're the most remarkable person I have ever met. The kitchen was very warm. It was not due to the stove. She went back to being Miss Hale to his Mr. Barlow for approximately 2 days, and then she stopped bothering, because names are intimate things, and she had already crossed that particular line without noticing she was doing it. In the second month, a situation arose that required her to do something that was not strictly within the terms of their arrangement. One of the ranch hands, a young man named Cody, 19 years old and recently arrived from Arkansas, was discovered by George Creasy to have been stealing small amounts of grain from the feed stores and selling it to a passing trader. The amount was not large, perhaps $2 worth over 3 weeks, but theft was theft, and the ranch code on the matter was clear. Phineas was going to dismiss him. Ida found this out from Mrs. Creasy the evening before it was to happen, and she went and found Phineas in his study, a room she had not been in before, lined with more books than she had expected, including, she noted immediately, a very battered copy of Darwin, and said, Before you dismiss Cody, will you tell me why he was selling the grain? Phineas looked up from his accounts. Does it change what he did? It might change what you do about it, she said. He considered this. All right, I didn't ask him. Will you? He asked. It turned out that Cody had a sister in Caldwell who was 3 months behind on her rent and had written to him in desperation, and he had no wages coming for another 10 days and no other means to help her. He had intended to pay the grain back from his wages. He had been too ashamed to ask for help. Phineas was silent for a long time after Cody told him this. Then he said that the cost of the grain would be docked from Cody's wages, but that the position was not terminated. He also advanced Cody 10 days of wages on the spot, which he did not mention was an advance. Afterward, Ida said, You're a difficult person to have simple feelings about. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, That works both ways, Miss Hale. She felt heat move up the back of her neck and looked somewhere else. The 3rd month was when things began to change in ways she could no longer manage by simply being practical about them. It started small. He found her reading one evening. She had borrowed one of his books, a natural history text she had taken from the shelf with his general standing permission to use the library end instead of leaving her to it. He sat down and they talked about the book for 2 hours, and then about the ones adjacent to it, and then about ideas in general, and it turned out that Phineas Barlow had a mind that she found deeply compelling in a way she had not anticipated, a mind that was careful and curious and willing to change its position when presented with good evidence, which was rarer than it should have been in anyone and rarer still in men who had built something through sheer physical force of will. The conversation lasted until nearly midnight, and Mrs. Creasy came and put her head in the door at 10 o'clock and said she was going to bed and that they should too, in a tone that made Ida feel precisely 12 years old. After Mrs. Creasy was gone, Phineas had said, You love ideas the way your father loved the land. And she had said, I suppose that's true, I never thought of it that way. And he had said, It's a fine way to be. And they had sat with that for a moment in the firelight, and she had thought, I am in a great deal of trouble. She was not wrong. The trouble clarified itself toward the end of the 3rd month, on a Sunday afternoon when the hands were off and Mrs. Creasy was visiting her daughter in town, and George Creasy was somewhere on the far end of the property. And Ida and Phineas were both in the yard doing separate tasks that had somehow resulted in them both ending up at the corral fence, watching a colt that had been born 3 weeks earlier, and was currently engaged in the highly entertaining business of learning that its legs worked. They were laughing. They were standing at the fence and laughing at a colt learning to run, and she was leaning on the rail with her arms folded, and he was beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the afternoon air, and it was the most comfortable she had felt in possibly years, and she thought, "This is forbidden, not by anyone else's rule, by mine, because I am here to settle a debt and go home to my father's land, and that is the whole of my purpose here." "What are you thinking?" he said. She told him the truth, because she had promised herself she would be honest with him the way he had been honest with her. "I'm thinking that this is a problem," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I have land in Kansas," she said. "That's where I belong, that's what I'm here for." "I know," he said again. She turned and looked at him and said with some difficulty, "I don't want to handle this badly. You've been kind to me and I don't want to handle it badly." His expression was so carefully controlled that she knew it was covering something much less controlled. "Ida," he said slowly, "I don't know what you want me to say." "I don't know what I want you to say either," she said honestly. They stood at the fence in the afternoon light and said nothing for a while, and the colt ran unsteadily around the corral, and somewhere to the east the Cimarron continued its slow return to something manageable after the flood. Then Phineas said, "Your father's land, the 40 acres, can it support a person comfortably?" She frowned. "It can support a person, yes. It's grassland good for cattle or horses. The well is good. There's a house, small but solid. Why?" He was looking at the colt, not at her. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about what comes after the 6 months. I go home," she said. "Yes," he said. "Or," she waited. "Or," he said, "some arrangement becomes possible that I haven't quite worked out how to put to you without it sounding like something it isn't." She looked at his profile in the afternoon sun, the strong jaw, the dark eyes focused on the middle distance, the careful way he was holding himself still as if any sudden movement might break something fragile. "Then take your time working it out," she said quietly. "You've been precise about everything else. Take your time with this too." He turned and looked at her then, and the expression on his face was something she felt rather than read, warm and uncertain and honest, layered over something much deeper that she was not yet sure she had the right to name. "All right," he said. "I'll take my time." They went back to the house separately, 5 minutes apart, like two people who were being sensible about something. Ida sat in the front room with her leather work and held the awl in her hand, and did not use it for approximately 10 minutes, which was wasted time, and she told herself so firmly. The 4th month brought a crisis that had nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with the frontier reality they were both living in. A man named Rupert Slade came to the ranch. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 companions, all of them carrying the kind of stillness that was not peace, but was its opposite, the stillness of men who were used to having their presence mean something threatening. He said he represented a cattle company out of Texas that had been moving a herd north through the territory, and had lost approximately 40 head that he believed had ended up on Barlow land, possibly mixed into the Barlow herd during the confusion of the spring floods. Phineas received him in the yard with the measured courtesy he showed everyone, and George Creasy stood slightly to his left in the way that meant he was positioned to be useful if necessary. 2 of the ranch hands were visible at different points around the yard, occupied with tasks but aware. Ida watched from the kitchen window because she was working near the window and had a clear view, and she was good at reading situations from a distance. Slade's story was plausible. Floods did scatter cattle, and mixed herds were a regular feature of spring on the territory. The proper response was to allow a tally of the herd and identify any Texas-branded cattle and return them, which was exactly what Phineas offered to do. What Slade actually wanted, it became clear over the course of 20 minutes, was to conduct the tally himself with his own men, unsupervised, which was a very different thing from what he had asked for. Ida set down her work and went outside. She was not sure why. She was not part of this situation by any formal arrangement, and Phineas was handling it with complete competence, and there was no reason for her to be in the yard. But she had spent 6 weeks watching this ranch, and she knew its rhythms, and she knew the hands by name, and she had been watching Slade's second companion, a narrow man who had not spoken, watching the barn rather than the conversation, and she did not like the look of it. She walked to the barn, not hurrying. Inside, in the dim smell of hay and horses and leather, she found the narrow man. He had a hand on the latch of the tack room where the ranch's firearms and ammunition were stored. She said, "Can I help you?" He startled, then composed himself and gave her a smile that was entirely unpleasant. "Just looking around, ma'am." "The tack room isn't a viewing area," Ida said pleasantly. "And Mr. Barlow's hospitality to guests does not extend to his stored property." She held the man's gaze without blinking. "I'll let him know you were in here looking for something." The man left. Ida followed him back to the yard at a distance that made it clear what she was doing. In the end, Slade and his companions left without their tally, and without whatever the narrow man had been hoping to find in the tack room, and Phineas conducted his own tally over the following 2 days and found 11 head that carried a Texas brand, and arranged to have them returned through the proper channels. That evening he said to Ida, over supper, "George told me what happened in the barn." "It wasn't much," she said. "It might have been," he said. "If he'd gotten into that room." He was quiet for a moment. "Why did you go in there?" "I was watching Slade's second man," she said. "He wasn't looking at the right things." Phineas looked at her across the table with an expression she was learning to read, which was the expression of a man who was working very hard not to say something out loud that he felt very clearly. "Ida," he said. "Phineas," she said. "Thank you. You're welcome." George Creasy, across the table, ate his supper with the careful expression of a man who was absolutely not smiling. The 5th month was the one where everything became undeniable. It happened in stages, and it happened honestly, which was the only way it could have happened given the 2 people involved. There was no dramatic declaration and no single overwhelming moment. There was instead a gradual and total closing of the remaining distance between them, the way a river finds its way to a lower level, not all at once but inevitably, following the shape of the ground. He rode with her one morning to check the eastern fence line, and they talked for 3 hours about everything about Kansas and the territory and the shape of the frontier, and what it was taking from people, and what it was giving them, about the books they had both read and the ones they wanted to read, about what they believed and what they weren't sure about, and what they had decided not to worry about. She told him things about her childhood that she had not told another person, including the fact that she had once, at the age of 14, read her first Darwin in a church, and understood it entirely and told no one because the truth was not always a thing you could give people without first knowing whether they were ready for it. He told her about his father, a hard, narrow man who had hit first and thought second, and who had died of drink when Phineas was 20, and who Phineas had spent 15 years trying not to think about and another 5 years trying to think about correctly, which meant neither as a monster nor as an excuse, but as a man who had made choices and whose choices had consequences. "I was afraid for a long time," he said, "that I was like him, that it was something that would come out eventually." "Is it?" she said. He considered the question seriously, which she knew he would. "I don't think so," he said, "but the fear made me careful. I've been careful with people. Too careful sometimes." The silence was an answer. Then, probably. She thought about hidden motives and dark pasts and the way people carry their history like stones in their pockets, and she thought about her own stones, the closed-off self-sufficiency, the suspicion of kindness, the way she had learned to depend on no one because dependence was how you got hurt on the frontier. "I think we've been careful in the same way," she said. He looked at her in the long afternoon light on the east fence line, and the look said everything he had been taking his time working out. She reached over and took his hand. Just that. Just his hand in hers, both of them gloved, both of them on horseback, the prairie stretching out around them in every direction with its enormous, indifferent beauty. And she held his hand, and he held hers, and they rode back toward the ranch in the late afternoon without letting go. He proposed to her at the end of the 5th month. He did it properly and carefully, and with no assumption about the answer, sitting across from her at the table in the study after supper, with the Darwin between them that they had been arguing about for an hour and the fire low and warm behind them. And he said that he would like to marry her if she would have him, and that he understood completely if she had reservations, and that whatever she decided, the debt note was still being settled on the agreed terms because that was a separate matter from this one. She said, "Ask me in a month." He nodded immediately. "All right. I need to think about it properly," she said. "Not just about you, but about everything. What it means for the land in Kansas. What it means for who I am." "I know," he said. "Take the time." She took the time. She thought about her father's 40 acres and the well he had dug and the dreams he had built and what he had wanted for them, and whether that land, his land, her land, could still be what she went home to, or whether home could be somewhere else without that being a betrayal of the man who had raised her to love the ground beneath her feet. She thought about what she had been afraid of, and what she was less afraid of now and why, and what Phineas Barlow had done and not done to create that difference. She wrote a long letter to a woman she had known in Wichita, a friend, the closest thing to a close friend she had, and asked her, without being entirely specific, what she thought a person owed to the past when the future was offering something worth having. The friend wrote back and said, "You owe the past your memory. You owe the future your life." On the morning of the last day of the 5th month, she went and found him in the barn. "Yes," she said. He turned from the horse he was brushing and looked at her. "I'll marry you," she said, "if your answer is still the same." "It is," he said. "There are conditions," she said. "Of course there are," he said, and this time the smile was full and immediate and completely unguarded, and she thought, "There it is. There is the thing I could not let myself look at for 5 months. The conditions were these: she would keep the Kansas land, she would not sell it or transfer it. It would remain in her name as her property and be leased to a tenant farmer who would maintain it. The income from the lease would be hers. If at any point she decided she wanted to return to it, that option remained open." He agreed to every condition without negotiation, because he understood immediately why each one mattered. The 6th month passed in the planning and the settling of the debt. All of it, the full $221.40. Not a cent forgiven, because she had insisted on that too. And she paid the last of it from the lease income that arrived from the Kansas tenant, along with the saddlework earnings she had accumulated in the preparation for a wedding that would be held at the Barlow Ranch on the 2nd Saturday of November, 1882. They were married by the circuit preacher who came through Beaumont territory every 6 weeks, in the front yard of the ranch house with the prairie and the enormous sky around them, and the whole of the Barlow Ranch hands present, and Mrs. Creasy crying quietly and George Creasy pretending not to notice that his wife was crying while also having something complicated happening with his own eyes. Ida wore a dress that she had made herself from a length of deep blue wool that she had found in the dry goods in the nearest town, and her hair was up, and she was not nervous. She had done the thinking. She had made the choice. She was not nervous. Phineas stood in the yard in a coat and clean shirt that he wore with the slight discomfort of a man who is more natural outdoors than dressed formally, and when she came across the yard toward him, the expression on his face was something she decided she wanted to spend the rest of her life putting there. The preacher was brief and sincere, which was exactly right. They said the words. He put a ring on her finger, a simple gold band that had been his mother's, which she learned afterward, and which made her hold very still for a moment when he told her. Then she took off the locket she had worn since her mother's death, a small oval gold thing on a chain, and put it in her own palm and looked at it for a moment, and then she put it back on, because carrying your past was not the same as being trapped by it. Mrs. Creasy had made a wedding supper that was remarkable in its abundance, and the hands sat at long tables in the yard in the November chill and ate and talked, and someone produced a fiddle from somewhere, and the evening ended with dancing, which Phineas turned out to be adequate at, and Ida turned out to be surprisingly good at. And they danced in the cold yard under the stars of the Oklahoma Territory until it was very late and the fire was burning low, and the hands had drifted off to the bunkhouse, and Mrs. Creasy had given Ida a hug of remarkable intensity for a small woman and gone inside. Then it was just the two of them in the yard with the fire and the stars and the empty supper tables, and they stood together in the November cold, and she leaned against him, and his arms came around her, and that was very fine. "Regrets," he said. "Not one," she said. "You?" "Not one," he said. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was cold and still and full of small interior warmths that Ida had not known she was missing until she had them. She learned his habits, the early rising, the systematic approach to any problem, the quality of attention he paid to anyone speaking to him that made them feel their words were being genuinely received. He learned hers, the directness, the love of argument, the way she organized a space, and then reorganized it when she found a better system, the Darwin that now lived on her side of the bedroom, and that she read in the evenings with the focused pleasure of someone returning to an old conversation. They were, both of them, people who had been alone for a long time and were cautiously learning not to be. And sometimes the old solitary habits came up against each other and had to be negotiated. And this required honesty that was sometimes uncomfortable and always worth it. He taught her things about cattle that she found genuinely interesting, the breeds, the grazing patterns, the economics of the market. She taught him leather working well enough that he could do basic harness repairs himself, which he said was a useful skill, and which she suspected he had pursued in part because the work was one more thing they could do in the same room. In the spring they found out she was carrying a child. She told him in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, matter-of-factly, because she was a matter-of-fact person and this was a fact. He sat down in the kitchen chair as if his legs had made a unilateral decision, and she thought for a moment he might be distressed, and then she saw his face. He was not distressed. He reached for her hand and held it in both of his and said nothing for a full half-minute, and then he said, "Are you well?" "Perfectly," she said. "I'm very healthy and this is a healthy place and I intend to continue working until I cannot, and then I'll rest, and then afterward I'll work again. I'm not going to be managed about it." "I know," he said. "I wouldn't dare." "Good," she said. "Then we're agreed, Mrs." Creasy cried again when told, and George Creasy shook Phineas's hand with an emotion that went well beyond the handshake and into the territory of things men like George Creasy did not say out loud. The summer of 1883 was long and warm and full. The ranch prospered. The leather work had expanded beyond Ida's original arrangement into a small but real business. She had taken on work from 3 neighboring ranches by this point, and had begun teaching one of the younger hands, a quiet boy named Abel who had a natural aptitude for the craft, so that the work could continue at full pace even as her condition advanced. The Kansas land had a good tenant, a young family named Pryor who wrote her careful letters twice a year and whose care for the place was evident in their descriptions of it. The well was working. The grass was good. The Pryors had planted an apple tree which made her think of her father and smile. In the October of 1883, their son was born. He was strong and loud and healthy, which was what mattered, and Phineas sat beside the bed for the whole of the labor with his hand available for her to crush when she needed it, without complaint, and without the flinching that she had seen in some men when confronted with the hard reality of childbirth. And she was grateful for this, because she needed all of her available will for the task, and could not spare any to manage someone else's discomfort. When it was over, and the baby was in her arms red-faced and outraged by the entire situation, Phineas looked at the two of them with an expression she could not entirely read except that it contained something very close to awe, and he said, "He looks like he's already got opinions about things." "Good," Ida said. "He'll need them." They named him James after her father, and the name felt right from the first day. James Barlow was, from the beginning, a child of enormous energy and determined will and loud demands and excellent health, and he was adored by everyone on the ranch, with a thoroughness that Ida occasionally found mildly alarming. Mrs. Creasy in particular treated him as if he were the central accomplishment of her life's work, which perhaps from a certain angle he was. Phineas was a steady, thoughtful father present in the way that mattered, which was in all the small daily moments rather than only in the large ceremonial ones. He held James while Ida worked. He carried him out to see the horses in the evenings with the solemnity of someone conducting a proper introduction. He read to him haltingly at first, choosing the simpler books and then with more confidence, and by the time James was old enough to look at the pictures with active interest, Phineas had worked his way through most of the ranch's library and was genuinely enjoying it. "You see," Ida said, watching them one evening, Phineas with James on his lap and a natural history of birds open between them, "I told you reading was worthwhile." "You were right," he said, not looking up from the birds. "I usually am," she said. He looked up then with the full smile, the one she had learned to look for and still found herself unprepared for. "I know," he said. James grew. The ranch grew. The leather business that had started as a debt repayment had, by 1885, become a genuine enterprise. Ida had taken on a business partner of sorts, a woman in the nearest town named Frances Acaffer, who had started a dry goods shop and wanted to carry leather goods alongside her regular stock. Frances was formidable and precise, and had a gift for commerce that Ida respected enormously, and they had built a working arrangement that made both of their operations more profitable. Phineas and Frances Acaffer met for the first time at a town meeting in 1885, and sized each other up over the course of about 45 seconds, before reaching an obvious mutual conclusion that the other person was entirely trustworthy, which Ida found deeply satisfying since she had already reached that conclusion about both of them independently. In the spring of 1886, Ida discovered she was pregnant again, and this time the discovery was quieter. She was sitting on the porch in the evening and Phineas came out and sat beside her, and she said simply, "We're going to have another child." And he took her hand and they sat in the spring evening and listened to the prairie, and the simplicity of it was its own kind of grace. Their daughter was born in October of 1886, 3 years and 2 weeks after James. They named her Clara, for no particular reason except that it suited her immediately. She was smaller and quieter than James had been and looked at the world from the beginning with a grave, considering expression that Phineas said was entirely from her mother's side. "James has your stubbornness," Ida said. "Clara has your patience. I think that's fair." "That's not how heredity works," he said. "I know," she said. "I've read the Darwin." He laughed, the full, real laugh that she had been collecting for 4 years and still found extraordinary from a man who was so careful with most things. The years that followed were not without difficulty. The frontier was not a gentle place. There was a drought in 1887 that was hard on the cattle and harder on some of the smaller operations around them, and Phineas extended credit to 2 neighboring ranchers and did not collect all of it when the rains returned, which was not strictly good business, but was entirely consistent with the man he was. There was a disease moving through some of the horse herds in the territory in 1888 that required careful management and cost them 3 animals before they contained it. George Creasy broke his arm in a fall and was laid up for 2 months, during which Phineas took on a significant portion of his work without complaint, and Ida took on another portion of it, and the ranch did not falter. There was a political upheaval in the territory that touched them all: the land runs, the question of the unassigned lands, the treatment of the peoples who had been there before any of this, and who were being pressed further and harder with each passing year. Phineas had worked beside Osage and Creek men for years, and felt the injustice of what was happening in the territory as a real and present wrong, not an abstraction. He said so when there were people to say it to, and he employed fairly and paid fairly and treated every man on his operation according to his work rather than his origin, and he knew that this was not enough, but he did it consistently. Ida, whose father had known the Osage names for every prairie plant, felt this particular grief from the inside. She could not fix it. She could witness it accurately, and refused to pretend it was something other than what it was, and that was what she did. James, at 5, was curious about everything. Clara, at 2, was beginning to demonstrate that the grave, considering expression was not passivity, but was in fact the surface of a very active interior life, which became clear when she began talking and turned out to have a great deal to say. In the evenings, Ida sat in the study with one or both children while Phineas read or worked at accounts, and this arrangement, domestic, quiet, full of the small sounds of a family in a house that contained enough room for all of them, was something she could look at sometimes with a kind of wondering clarity, as if she were outside it for a moment and could see it whole, and think. I did not know this was what I was going toward when I rode into that river. She had been going toward her father's land. She had been going toward a deadline and a debt, and a document sewn into the lining of her coat. She had gone through a flood and come out on the other side of it entirely. One afternoon in the autumn of 1888 she walked down to the Cimarron alone. She went for no particular reason. Phineas was at the north pasture, the children were with Mrs. Creasy, the leather work was caught up, and she simply walked south and then west and followed the line of the river. It was nothing like it had been in May of 1882. It was low and clear and gentle, catching the autumn light and throwing it back in long golden pieces. The cottonwoods along the bank were losing their leaves in the warm fall air, and the leaves were the color of the brass the river had been when it was trying to kill her. She stood on the bank and looked at it for a long time. She thought about that day. The fear had been real. She would not rewrite it into something clean and triumphant, but even in the middle of it, in the worst of the current's pull, she had not been fully certain that she would die. She had been fighting so hard that there had not been much room for certainty about anything except the fighting. And then there had been a hand around her wrist. She thought about fate, and she thought about accident, and she thought about the difference between them, which she had never been entirely sure was as large as people made it. The river had flooded because of rain north of the territory. She had been there because of a debt note. The debt note had been written dishonestly by a man who was trying to steal her father's land, and Phineas had been on the ridge because he was the kind of man who watches a flooded river because he is responsible for the land around it. All of those things together had led to a hand around her wrist, and the hand around her wrist had led to everything else. It was not fate. It was not entirely accident either. It was the specific, complicated intersection of who they both were, arriving at the same place at the same time because of all the choices that had made them who they were. She was still thinking about this when she heard a horse behind her and turned, and of course it was Phineas, because he was the kind of man who noticed when someone he loved had taken a long walk alone and went to find them. He dismounted and came to stand beside her at the river's edge, and he looked at the water for a moment and then at her. "I come here sometimes," she said, "just to look at it." "I know," he said. "I've seen you." She looked at him. "You never came before." "I thought you might need the quiet," he said. "Today it seemed like you might want the company." She thought, "He is right, and he knew it before I did, and I have been married to this man for 6 years, and I am still sometimes surprised by the accuracy of his attention." She took his hand. They stood at the edge of the Cimarron in the autumn light, the river gentle and clear and ordinary, nothing like the brown violence she remembered. The cottonwood leaves fell around them in the warm air. A pair of herons passed downstream, low and deliberate. "I've been thinking," she said, "about everything that would have had to be different for none of this to happen. And I'm glad it wasn't different," she said. "Even the hard parts, even the flood." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was terrified when I rode in after you." She looked at him. "You didn't look terrified." "I was," he said. "I couldn't see most of the river from where I was. I didn't know if I'd get to you in time." "You did," she said. "You were already most of the way to the bank," he said. "You'd gotten yourself there. I just helped with the last part." She laughed, a real, full laugh that went up into the prairie air, because that was exactly what she had said to him 6 years ago in the kitchen after he had told her he intended to forgive the note, and he had remembered it perfectly, because of course he had. "That's right," she said when she'd stopped laughing. "I did." "You did," he agreed, with perfect seriousness and the shadow of a smile. She leaned against him the way she had on their wedding night in the yard, and his arm came around her, and they stood at the Cimarron in the October afternoon. The river ran clear and low over its stones. The sky was wide and bright and entirely itself, neither indifferent nor concerned, simply enormous and present. She thought about her father naming plants in Osage and English and Latin, and carrying his Darwin and believing in good faith that the land was fair and people were essentially kind. She thought about the 40 Kansas acres with the apple tree the Pryors had planted. She thought about James, who had her stubbornness and his grandfather's curiosity, and was currently, almost certainly, convincing Mrs. Creasy to let him do something she had told him not to do. She thought about Clara, who looked at the world with those dark eyes that were her father's and thought about everything before she said anything which would serve her well. She thought about a hand closing around her wrist in the Cimarron River. "Phineas," she said. "Ida. I'm going to say something that I don't usually say." "All right," he said carefully. "I'm happy," she said. "I want you to know that, not as a thing that is taken for granted. I want to say it plainly so it's said." He held her closer slightly, and she felt the breath he took before he said, "So am I more than I knew how to be before." They stood together at the edge of the river until the light began to change toward evening, and then they rode back toward the house together, close enough that their stirrups occasionally touched. The ranch house came into view over the rise, the limestone walls warm in the late light, the kitchen window yellow from the lamp inside, the smoke from the supper fire rising straight in the still air. From inside, even at this distance, they could hear James' some sort of declaration being made at volume, because that was how James communicated anything important, which was everything. And then Clara's voice, quieter but clear, making her own considered response to whatever James had declared. Phineas said, "He's found something." "He always finds something," Ida said. "Gets that from somewhere," he said. "Not from my side," she said primly, and he laughed, and they put their horses into a walk and came home across the autumn grass in the last of the October light, the Cimarron behind them and the whole of their life ahead, settled and full and warm with everything they had built together out of a river and a debt, and an ordinary extraordinary act of one person riding toward another without stopping to decide whether it was worth it. It had been worth it. It was worth it every day after that. Every morning that they rose in the limestone house on the prairie, and every evening they sat in the firelight with their books and their children and each other. And every season that turned the grass and brought the cattle and the floods and the droughts, and the ordinary complicated business of living on the frontier with honesty and attention and love. It was worth it every time Ida stood at the window in the early morning and watched the light come across the prairie, that low, golden, enormous light that her father had taught her to see and felt the deep, settled certainty of a person who has fought for the right things and found them and held on to them. Worth every drop of the Cimarron River, worth every mile, worth all of it. In the spring of 1890, another letter arrived from the Pryors in Kansas, a good letter, full of practical news about the land, the cattle they had put on it, the second apple tree they had planted beside the first. At the bottom of the letter, almost as an afterthought, Mary Pryor had written, "The well is remarkable, Mrs. Barlow. I think your father must have had a gift for finding the good water." Ida read this letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the box where she kept her most important papers, alongside the deed to the Kansas land, and the original note from the First Bank of Beaumont, marked paid in full in Phineas's precise handwriting, and the letter her Wichita friend had written about what you owe the past and what you owe the future. She went and found Phineas in the yard where he was mending a section of fence. He still did his own fence work, which George Creasy called unnecessary and which Phineas called good practice, and she said, "The Pryors say the well is remarkable." He looked up. "Your father dug it." "He did," she said. He looked at her with that full, steady gaze, and he said, "He knew how to find things worth having." She thought about 40 acres and a good well and a letter carried in the lining of a coat through a flood. She thought about what her father had believed in and how he had been wrong about the fairness of things and right about everything that mattered. She thought about what he would have made of Phineas Barlow, and she thought he would have approved, not because Phineas was easy or uncomplicated or without his own darkness to account for, but because he was honest, and that had always been the thing her father cared about most. "Yes," she said, "he did." She leaned against the fence post beside him in the spring morning, and the prairie was greening up around the ranch in every direction, and James's voice carried from somewhere near the barn already up to something at 7 years old, already fully himself, and Clara's careful footsteps came across the porch where she had been sitting with a picture book, and her own interior commentary on everything she was reading. A meadowlark sang somewhere to the east, on the other side of the fence, in the direction of the river that had once tried to kill her, and had instead delivered her here. Ida Hale Barlow stood in the Oklahoma Territory spring and listened to it, and held the moment, and let it be everything it was. She had been the bravest person at the river in flood. She had needed to be. And he had been the rancher on the other bank who had ridden in after her, which she had needed him to be as well. And out of those two necessary things, this life, all of it, every word of it. Every mile and every morning and every argument and every laugh and every child and every evening by the fire with the Darwin open and the world outside enormous and indifferent and full of the specific kind of beauty that does not care whether you see it and is there anyway, stubbornly, persistently, in every season without exception. All of it exactly enough. All of it exactly right.